Hey everyone, it's Irene here. Welcome to this live chat here on YouTube. And I'm just gonna start by saying thank you for watching this. If you're watching this, it's probably the recording. We're waiting for people to get on this live stream. And if you are brand new to me, my name is Irene Lyon. I am the founder, the curator of this YouTube channel. And what you're going to learn from me today has to do with things around trauma, healing trauma, the nervous system, neuroplasticity, and really getting into the root of how to heal so many of our human conditions, ranging from chronic illness, mental illness, relationship troubles. We might even dive into parenting and just what it takes to truly heal for real. So I see some folks already coming in there. Hello, Lizzie. Hello, Gary. Hello, Yelena from Michigan. Let me know where you're all from. I have already got many questions here that I have compiled over the last little while. So what I'm probably going to do is start with them. And what you're going to find out as we go through this chat, and as I go through, there might be other resources that I have. So obviously I've got hundreds of YouTube videos. I have a blog with articles, and I've also got paid online programs and many free resources on my site. So if you've never visited my site, you can take a peek at that later, or open up another browser on your computer and look at irenelyon.com and check out what I do over there. I obviously do lots of YouTube, but also teaching. I teach live and online. So I'm going to get into a question that has to do with what it means to heal at the deepest level. And this was a question that was put in via Facebook, actually. And this is from someone by the name of Bethany. So if you're here, Bethany, let me know. And we're going to get to this question. So you say here, is there a point at which you would consider someone's autonomic nervous system regulated, you have in quotes, and treatment is complete? With the understanding, of course, that we all continue to grow and change. So I wanted to start off with this question around, I'll just say it one more time, would you consider someone's autonomic nervous system regulated and treatment is complete? So is there a point where that just is, you're done, there's no more need to do in terms of healing traumas, it's just kind of like utopia? And the answer to this requires a little bit of background. So I'm going to give you an example, or really a metaphor. To me, healing the nervous system, it's like language. So if you think about it, we all usually have a primary language, we would call it our mother tongue. And for me, it's English. For you, it might be a different language. And then sometimes we learn other languages down the road. Maybe we went to an immersion school. I learned French when I was in elementary school. But French was still not my mother tongue. So there are, we're gonna say two groups of people, and I'm oversimplifying this in many ways. The nervous system, so our autonomic nervous system, that is what governs our fight, flight, and freeze mechanisms. So I have to teach a little bit here. We have these survival responses, essentially. And when we sense threat, when we sense unsafety, our system will mount a response to protect our physiology, and often it's our brain, in many ways our psyche. So we often think of trauma. When I say the word trauma, what do you think of? Often people think of accidents, they think of war, they think of being in horrific situations of abuse and being attacked and natural disasters. And those are definitely traumatic events. We will call those shock traumas. The thing is that from this world of somatic healing, and that's my background, is in somatic experiencing and working at the level of the body and how stress gets trapped in the body. When we have a traumatic thing occur to us, we keep that trauma pending on our upbringing and conditioning. So if we had a healthy, nurturing, caring, regulated environment growing up, what we would hope, and we also would say secure attachment, really good attunement, caregivers that were also well-regulated, healthy in their mental and physical, when we have that really nice foundation, our autonomic nervous system, so how we govern our fight, flight, and freeze mechanisms, that nervous system gets built in a really healthy way. So we would say that a person is getting good regulation from the start. We would say that they have secure attachment, that they have nurture, that they're learning empathy, that they're learning how to self-soothe and self-regulate their nervous system. Because it's important to know that when a brand new human baby, but also mammalian animal is born, they need nurturing to learn how to self-regulate and self-soothe. And humans, us, all of us here, we are the most complex machine, if you call it that, or organism on the planet, in that we are born and we're not just able to pop out of mom and start walking. We need to learn how to feel our system, how to down-regulate, self-regulate. When we get good nurturing, that is built into us. Okay, that is built into us. Let's just say that that didn't occur. And the research is showing us through the Adverse Childhood Experiences study, it's also named the ACE study, that when there is early stress, when there is early adversity, there's also other types of adversity that aren't just regarding abuse and not enough shelter and food, but being, let's say, in an incubator, because maybe we were born premature, or maybe we had lots of surgeries as a little one because maybe we had a heart defect, or maybe there was a stressor in our environment, like mom lost her husband, your father, or someone close, and there was a big stress. So there can also be adversity imposed on a little one, even when there isn't adversity in terms of physical abuse, sexual abuse, etc. So when we're born and we don't have that good nurture, our nervous system, our autonomic nervous system, it gets wired, but it doesn't get wired in the best way possible. And the term for this is dysregulation. So there's regulation of the nervous system, the autonomic nervous system, where we know how to self-soothe and self-correct intense feelings and digest and integrate. And then there's dysregulation, and it's a spectrum where we may not have gotten that solid start. So why am I giving you this long segue into this question? To remind you, the question, for those of you jumping on, was asked from Bethany, and she asked, is there a point where you would consider someone's autonomic nervous system regulated and treatment is complete? So if someone has a solid early upbringing and they have regulation from the start, they had really good, vibrant health as a kiddo, they were allowed to express and be emotionally free, and they weren't shamed in a toxic way by their parental systems and school systems, which sadly was not the case for many of us living in industrialized and Western worlds. If we had that, we may experience a car accident or a shock trauma, or maybe even a natural disaster, or maybe we break a bone skiing or something like that, or maybe we see something that isn't nice. When something like that occurs to us, and we've already had the base, the foundation, we have a better tendency to bounce back and not end up with post-traumatic stress, or a chronic illness that can pop out of post-traumatic stress, or a mental issue that can come out of that shock trauma. Our likelihood to bounce back is a lot quicker, a lot easier. I go into this example deeper in a 3-part healing trauma series that I have on my site. My assistant Crystal will pop it up. That's a free training. You can go into that a little deeper. However, if a person did not have that solid regulation from the start, if they didn't have the tools and learned from day 0 to 3 years old, that's the important window from when we're born and also in utero to 3 years old. That's when our autonomic nervous system is really being built and wired for life. If we didn't get that, and then we have, let's say, a shock trauma like an accident, or maybe physical abuse, sexual abuse, maybe a natural disaster, maybe just intense stress due to pressures in school, or it could be university, or it could be the loss of a loved one. If we don't have that good foundation, the system is more at risk for suffering the effects of traumatic stress. So, to come back to this question, this isn't always that straightforward. Someone's system that didn't get that early good regulation, they will be in a process for most of their life, from what I've seen, working on restoring regulation. And regulation can be had, it can be built, it can be acquired, and it takes a lot of work. It's positive work, it's good work, but we're essentially wiring. So I'm using my hands right now. If you think about the nervous system wires, when we're born, we want them to wire such that we have the ability to self-soothe and self-regulate. If those wires were never wired together because of lack of nurturing, misattunement, not having secure attachment, et cetera, those wires are kind of dangling. They're not fused. And so as an adult, if we're like, if we all of a sudden learn the research and we realize, wow, this early adversity I had really young in life is causing these health problems I have, mental and physical, and I'll get into those in a second, I have to restore and do to my system what never happened when I was an infant. And so that requires a process, that requires a learning, a relearning, an apprenticeship, if you will. We have to wire together these systems that were never actually wired in the first place, right? So often we hear people talk about rewiring the nervous system and resetting the nervous system. And here's the thing is, if the wires weren't built from the beginning, we're in some ways starting from scratch. There is no template. There is no map. And so we have to write a new map to understand what it means to feel sensation, to regulate ourselves, to bring ourselves back down to baseline. Because it's possible we've never felt baseline and regulation ever. And don't let that scare you, because I know of people, my husband is one of them, that grew up in adverse conditions with not good regulation, not having regulation. And clearly there's a reason I'm with him. It's because he's done the work, he's healed, and he's restored regulation back to the system. There's one little bit to this. If you started this recording at the very beginning, I mentioned language. For someone that didn't have that regulation at the beginning, it's as if they're learning a second language because they didn't get the language of regulation from the beginning. And so as an adult, it has a similarity to learning a second language as an adult. And I've learned a second language. It's not easy. If you don't practice it, it doesn't stick. Who here has learned a language and they know that unless they're in that culture, practicing daily, weekly, learning more vocabulary, more complexity, being put into situations that are a little less ideal, we will not wire those patterns. So for someone that had good regulation from the beginning, it's as if that's their first language. They know how to speak this language without thinking about it. It just happens. It just comes out. I hope that makes sense. Whereas someone that didn't have regulation to begin with, it's like they're learning a new language, and it can happen. Some people I know have learned second languages in their 30s and they are so fluent. They're fluent because they go to that country, they have friends, they practice, they study, they listen, they read, they watch television, all of it. So the nervous system is no different. So in other words, to come back to this, is there a point when I would consider someone's autonomic nervous system regulated and treatment is complete? I have to answer that question with a question, which is, what was the beginning like? Did someone have solid, secure attachment and regulation to begin with, or did they not? And then depending on that situation, you then have to look at how to proceed. If it's a shock trauma that was still no doubt traumatic, but they had solid regulation, their ability to bounce back and find and restore their regulation will be easier. If someone didn't have that language from the beginning, they're going to need to do a little bit more work. And this is what I do with my students when I work with them. We work at establishing foundation, a base. They have to learn about what's happening in their physiology. It can't just be education, and it can't just be practice. It has to be both. So I hope that gives you a little bit of insight. Bethany, that was your question. The metaphor of learning a language is really one of the best ways to describe it. Anyone that's ever tried to learn a second language, they know you got to practice. You can't just forget about it and expect it to be there. And learning how to have better regulation in the nervous system is no different. Okay. I'm just going to look at the comments. That's why my eyes are going to maybe dart over a little bit. Hello, everybody. Hey, from New York. I see some questions here that I am going to get into. Someone asks about constant zoning out and feelings of overwhelm and paralysis. So these sorts of situations where someone is overwhelmed, they feel paralyzed, maybe they're dissociating. Again, that comes back to that first example, or that example I gave. If we didn't have solid regulation from the beginning of our lives, and we didn't have good models in our parental or caregiver structures, here's the thing: humans have every potential when they are conceived and born. It is our environment that shapes us and how we choose to move forward. So if we know that we had the not the best upbringing and it just wasn't the best, that's okay, right? We accept it. We know that that's what occurred. It wasn't the best thing, and then we need to move forward. And the good news is that we know, based on the science, based on the topic and concept of neuroplasticity, that our nervous system, our brain, our tissues has the ability to change and rewire and remap and recreate different pathways. The key, though, and I'll talk about this as we get deeper into this chat, is we have to sequence the healing properly. I'll say that one more time. We have to sequence the healing properly. And this actually funnels into another question where someone asks, there's often people that think that I'm against things like meditation and mindfulness and breath work, and that's not true. It's just that if we, again, I'm going to use this template, if someone didn't have regulation to begin with, if someone didn't learn how to self-regulate and be with their sensations and experience stress without dissociating or going into hyperarousal, we need to start at a lower level, at a more baseline level. And so I have written about this in the past. We'll pop it up here for you guys. An article that I've written called Why I Believe the Mindfulness Bubble is going to Burst. To read it and read its entirety, it's a longer article. It'll probably take you 20 minutes to read. It's like a chapter in a book. You'll see that I encourage meditation and mindfulness when an individual can be connected to their environment, to their sensations, and stay with the biology without either zoning out or popping into more stress. And so one of the hallmarks of the situation of when we haven't had good early upbringing, if we didn't have good secure attachment, good attunement from our caregivers, some of the hallmarks of that is we cannot stay connected to the environment. And the reason why is because when we were growing up, let's just say it was a volatile household, nobody wanted to listen to us, our feelings were squashed. You know, the sayings, children should be seen and not heard. It starts as young as letting babies cry themselves to sleep in an attempt to help them self-soothe. It doesn't. It actually puts them into shutdown. So there's so many things that we do with our children, infants, and not knowing that put them into a disconnected and dissociated state. So if we were brought up disconnecting from our environment because our environment was not safe, or if we were disconnected from our own body because what we were feeling was too intense. If you think about that baby that's crying and crying and there's nobody there to soothe it and let it learn self-regulation, there comes a point where that baby shuts off. It shuts down. It isn't calming down in a healthy way. It's going into what's called a freeze response, a shutdown response. It's disconnecting from its body because what it's feeling is too painful and no one is there. So our imprints, our nervous system, our autonomic nervous system learns really, really early on, no one is there, the environment isn't safe, what I'm feeling feels horrible, I better just disconnect. And we disconnect from the body, we disconnect even sometimes from what happens in our mind, or it trains us to try to figure out what's wrong. And so to answer that question kind of as a side, when someone has lots of disconnection, they zone out, we have to go back to, well, why did that occur? And why is that occurring? Is it from a shock trauma later in life that was just so intense and it never got processed? Or is it from an early life where there wasn't enough nurturing so that we could handle intensity and stress around us? Okay, I'm just going to scroll here. How's everyone doing? Thank you, thank you. We've got just over 60 people here. So this question about mindfulness, it's interesting. This person asks or says that she sees that I often advise against these alternative practices like meditation and breath work, and claim that it can cause more harm than good. It's not so much that it's causing harm. The key is that are people doing it and staying connected? I have had enough experience to see and talk to clients who have gone into intensive meditation retreats or who meditate daily, but they aren't even aware that they're not feeling their bodies. They're not aware that the breath work is popping them into what we would call in the somatic healing world outside of their window of tolerance. Here's the thing. If I use that example again, if you didn't have that early strong upbringing of secure attachment, healthy attunement, and learning self-regulation, our window of tolerance might not even be a window. It might be a very fine line. It might not even be non-existent. And we live our lives in a constant cycle of coping and management strategies. This is so common in the Western industrialized world where it just was stressful in our environment growing up. The system demands that we shut down and not connect to ourselves. And so these practices are attractive because they can keep us in a more managed and coping-based sense. But from my experience, it's not actually providing true regulation. Because here's the thing. Someone asked me the other day, how do you know if breath work is helping to regulate the nervous system? My answer to that is because you no longer need breath work. You no longer need to meditate. When we have good regulation, we wake up in the morning after a restful night of sleep and we just go about our day. There's no need for routines. There's no need for having certain things in place. A lot of the obsessive compulsive disorders and behaviors of perfection and control are there for good reason. They're in an attempt to keep us safe and controlled and knowing where everything is. That is often bred, not always, but often bred from having an environment that was chaotic and out of control. And so if we grew up in an environment that was out of control, we couldn't express ourselves and be met with unconditional care and love, we will start to shift our behavior so that we get a good outcome. We will be nice always. We will always do for other people. We won't rock the boat. We won't express our strong opinions. We won't scream or cry because that was punished or it wasn't good behavior, if that makes sense. So there's nothing wrong with these practices. However, I've been in this health and healing industry since 1995, which is a long time. And I've seen trends, I've seen practices, I've seen the self-help industry boom. And now people are just as confused as before because they've tried all of these things and yet they still can't sleep. They still feel anxiety. They still have panic when they get on a plane. They can't connect with their loved ones. They lose relationships. They get into toxic relationships over and over again. They have chronic illnesses, even though they eat well and do all these things. And the thing is this deeper piece of regulating the nervous system from the ground up, it is actually quite simple in theory, and it takes practice. Just like when you have a newborn baby, that newborn baby isn't all of a sudden a regulated human being. Think about that for a second. It's a very important thing to see. When we're born, we aren't just regulated and able to handle all the emotions and everything that occurs. We have to learn. Even our immune system isn't strong and built when we're young, right? Our thinking isn't there, etc. Our language isn't there. We have to learn it through modeling, trial and error, nurture, being challenged, being pushed, resting, etc. And so if we know that we're wanting to learn regulation and get regulation back into our nervous systems, we've got to see it as a long-term lifestyle shift of learning and getting into the body and doing the things that we probably never, ever did ever in our early years. Those first 3 years of life are so key. Okay, I am going to go on to another question here. Someone says here, Kira says, and I apologize if I can't get to all of the comments. I just see what I'm seeing, so I'll read out things as I see fit with the current topic. So Kira says, my mother was taught to let me cry in my crib at night and not come in and soothe me. She said after the third night, I stopped crying. Yes, this is how the bulk of Western society and mothers and fathers needing to go to bed at night to work in the next day. This is how this has occurred, is baby's got to go to sleep so that mom and dad can get up the next morning and work. In more tribal cultures, you won't see that. The babies sleep with the parents. They're not in a separate room. You would never have a mother allow her cubs in the wild to sleep not with her, right? When mammals have babies in the wild, the litter, the pups, the cubs are with the mother. It doesn't make sense to disconnect from such a small little mammalian creature, which is what we are as babies, as human babies. And so even the process of putting a child in a separate room, in a crib, away from the primary caregiver when they are an immature being is the first problem. Right. And so what occurs is we've just gotten down this weird path where we don't realize that we are like the animals in the animal kingdom. We are nature, right? And we need to have that nurturing in our system in the same way. Okay. Lizzie asks, how do you learn to regulate, and how do you nurture and reparent yourself from scratch? I'll talk about this in a little bit. The main thing, Lizzie, is it comes down to building foundations, getting more education on board, and getting more capacity on board. And that's what I teach in my online programs. All that you can find on my site. I can talk a little bit about that at the end of this Q&A session. But suffice it to say, it can be retaught. I've seen it retaught. My husband has learned how to regulate his nervous system, and it requires an intense desire to be healthy and to do the work and to commit to it. That's really the number one thing. Okay, here's a question from someone that posted this on Instagram. They ask, when complex trauma is involved and repeated and continued exposure is the case, what can be done? And so, of course, this person says this is not ideal for healing, but court ordered. And then they ask, what can be done to help the children? So my hunch is this person is asking on behalf of perhaps their child and maybe themselves. And this we're seeing more and more where there might be a divorce, a separation, and there's joint custody. The reason why the separation might have happened or the divorce is because there was most likely an abusive parent. And there's complex trauma. So complex trauma, again, that means repeated over and over again. There is an unsafe environment. Things are just not allowed to be expressed. And essentially, there's no safety. And so again, to review, when there is not safety in our environment, as a little person, but also as an adult, our system is on survival mode 24/7. If we realize that we can't fight and we can't flee, which is often the case with kiddos, The third F is freeze. There's a more popular F being talked about these days called fawn. Fawn is just on the spectrum of freeze. It's a way of shutting down. It's a way of being quiet and small so that we don't get into trouble, so that we don't rock the boat. How many people have grown up here where we know when mom or dad comes home, whether by hearing the sound of their footsteps, by hearing the slam of the car door, how they go right into the kitchen and don't say hello, and they grab a drink, or they go right into their office and they don't say anything, versus them coming in and being softer with the door, coming and saying hello. Over a lifetime, a child gets to know these patterns. They get to know these sounds, these qualities, and they learn, oh, mom or dad is not in a good place. I'm not going to go talk to them. I'm just going to hide away in my room, be introverted. This is one reason we become very introverted, is we don't want to connect because it's not safe. So the reason I'm saying that is safety and unsafety is it's a fine line. And many of us think, oh, I didn't have any trauma growing up. But this example for many of you might be very true. And so even with that little, even if there wasn't physical abuse, sexual abuse, there was tons of food and shelter, we were given everything we wanted. But if our parental structures were not available and accessible, that is an environment of unsafety. That is an environment of conditional care and love. And over the course of an entire lifetime, 18 years, 10 years, living with that environment, it can put us into a situation of being in complex trauma. So I want to say that because a lot of people think, oh, I haven't had trauma because I had all these great things. We had tons of money, da, 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 da. It has nothing to do, not nothing, but at least in our Western, North American, European, Australian, British worlds where we're living fairly in good circumstance, right? Food, shelter. We think, oh, I had a good childhood. There's nothing that occurred specifically, but that little bit of insidious everyday stress and strain, it wears a child down. So to come back to this question, when complex is involved and there's repeated and continued exposure, what can be done and what can be done to help children? If you're a parent in this situation, I hate to say this, but you've got to do your best to stay in your own system and heal your own system. And when you're with that child, be unconditional. Allow them to express their feelings, play with them, do things with them, connect with them, let them drive in some ways what is done. Because if they're with, let's just say, an abusive parent due to court order, you may not be able to do anything about that. And you have to bring them into your own home when that time comes and help them heal, help them get the stress out, let them know they're safe. Unfortunately, if that's something that persists, you'll have to know that when they are adult, when they can choose who they live with, because usually there's a point where a child, I think it might be 14 years old, can choose, I don't want to be anymore with that parent, I want to be with this parent, or I want to go live with grandma or my aunt. They can choose that, and then that's when they start to gain their independence and their autonomy. Often we'll say to a lot of people, start saving money for a therapy fund so that child, when they are old enough to seek out professional help, they can do it and there's money there for it. I know that seems a bit strange, but in many ways, there are certain things that are out of our control, but what we can do is support what is there, control what we can, work on ourselves so that we can be a solid rock for that child, and then save funds so that when they need professional help, they can get it. Hopefully that gives you a little bit of insight there. The next question is on healing traumas that we don't remember. Now, I actually have a YouTube video on this already. It's one of my trauma tip videos, but I'll speak to it a little bit. So the question is, I've got lots of trauma and much that I can't remember, and I know it's holding me back from being who I am meant to be. And my inner self has locked it away and does not want the conscious me to remember. So here's what's interesting is that all of the traumatic stress that we carry in our system is somewhere in our system. And it's held and stored in what's called procedural memories. Now, procedural memories are I'll liken it to, if you think about computers, if you go to send a print job to a printer, that print job will hopefully print out the printed paper, right? You want to print a document, you hit send, it goes. I'm sure we've all experienced a time where you hit print and it gets jammed, or the printer and the computer aren't connected. But that job is waiting, it's spooling, it's waiting to release, to get out. When it comes to traumatic stressors that happened maybe when we were really young, maybe when we were in utero, and believe it or not, the research is showing that trans and intergenerational trauma gets carried on to offspring and down the road. I think it's like 17 generations. It's huge. Even if we didn't have that traumatic event happen in our lifetime, but in past lifetimes, it imprints in our DNA, in our cells. So it may not have been expressed, these traumatic events that we needed to release, but it's in the system somewhere. Now, the other thing that is interesting is that a lot of people think that to release trauma that's stored in the system, you have to shake, you have to tremor, you've got to, have a crazy movement fit, and then that means that you've released. And that can be true for some situations. It depends on what the traumatic experience was. There's a classic video of a polar bear from National Geographic where it has been stunned by a tranquilizer gun so that they can tag it and do research. And when that polar bear was tranquilized, it was in the process of running away from the helicopter, as any animal would if it sensed that it was being hunted. It's just part of biology. So when it was tranquilized, it was in the middle of running, and then it stopped. When it came out of that tranquilizer sleep, its legs started to run and shake. And it was the shaking fit that was releasing that print job, if you will, that stored procedure of I need to get away and I need to run. So, and maybe we can post that video here so you can see it. So if we as a human being had a situation where we were being attacked and we couldn't run away, or we were being held down in a surgery, this is very common with a lot of children that have had simple things like tonsillectomies, even dental surgeries where we have to be held down or we're put under anesthesia and we're trying to fight and then we get stopped. Then there might be a release, a desire to run, to hit, to punch, to scratch, to bite. We see this in a lot of physical attack and sexual abuse cases where a person is moving through that trauma and there is a clear procedural memory, a desire to get that stored stress, that attack energy, that fight, flight, attack energy out of the system. So that is where something like a shaking or a running response might come out. However, that actually isn't the reason most of us have complex PTSD and stress and the illnesses that connect with it. And I will get into those questions soon. For many of us, and for those of you just joining, I understand you might have missed the beginning of this, but I'm not going to repeat it, so you'll have to go back. But when we didn't have that early regulation, when our first language wasn't good nervous system regulation, because of just this low level, insidious unsafety, something didn't feel right. Often we weren't allowed to cry. Maybe we weren't allowed to show our anger. Maybe we weren't allowed to be expressive and be artistic. The ways that we heal that stuff not necessarily will come out in a big shaking response because it doesn't match up with the kind of traumatic event. It might be deep sadness. There's a type of sadness that is typical of that early upbringing. So there's some sadness, for example, that we would call nutritive sadness. So, if someone hurts themselves, or maybe you lose a pet, or you see something that just doesn't feel good and you feel sad for that thing you're seeing. But then there's this other type of sadness that's like an embedded biological sadness that is often we see in folks who have what we would consider or name depression, various mental illnesses. But that more biological sadness is from a lifetime of not getting our needs met, not having someone there to, kiss our owies when we fell over. Maybe we were told, just stand up, be tough, don't cry. That over a lifetime, a childhood, it squashes our life force energy. And so let's just say, hypothetically, that's your system. That's what occurred growing up. And this is so true for many of us, especially men. Healing that stuff may not be a big shaking response. And we don't even want to instigate that. We want to be more connected to our sensations, our emotions, feeling intensity of sadness and grief and despair, but not getting trapped and lost in it. So someone asked, so how do we start to regulate? How do we start to heal? One of the main premises of the work my team and I do is helping people understand that these emotions, if you track them, are sensations in the body. And when we can actually get better at feeling the sensations in the body and be with them, but not get engulfed and swallowed up by them, and staying connected to our environment, we can start to move, express, and integrate them. So to come back to this question of not being able to remember, that is less important. The important thing is doing the proper steps. I call it neuroplastic sequencing healing. We don't want to start by just taking a baseball bat and hitting a pillow, thinking that maybe we need to get an action out, a fight response. That might be true, but more often than not, that isn't what is needed. We need to learn how to be in our system, feel our sensations, and then track those sensations so that they don't overwhelm us. And that might mean small, little, tiny noticings of sensations. This is a concept called titration. Peter Levine, one of my teachers, one of my mentors, founded something called somatic experiencing. It's a third of what I do. But he uses this term titration. He takes it from organic chemistry, whereas we don't want to just throw a person into the boiling pot of water. It's just not healthy to just do that and immerse. We need to just have little tiny bits of feeling the sensations, knowing that we can stay connected to our body, staying in the environment, and being present to that sensation without disconnecting, dissociating, or going into more hyperarousal. What often occurs, if I go back to that question about breath work and meditation, often people go into those practices way too soon, and they don't know how to integrate and digest and essentially swallow and feel these sensations. And then they get too intense and then they shut down. That's parallel to that baby that's crying. And then all of a sudden they realize no one's here. I don't know how to handle this on my own. I'm just going to shut down. So we don't want that. We want to reverse engineer that so that we, in a sense, feel that bit of emotional discomfort just enough. And then we do the practices to stay connected to ourselves and learn how to self-regulate. All right. Someone asks, how do we know if your nervous system is actually healing? What are the signs? So it's true health. There's actually, I have an article on this. It's the 9 key benefits, I think, of a regulated nervous system. So our digestion works. We can sleep at night. We wake up in the morning refreshed. We have no trouble setting boundaries. We can be in stressful situations and not need to flee or run or shut down. Our immune system is healthy. So if we do get a common cold or something like that, we bounce back. Our wound healing, if we get a cut, it heals quite quickly. If we eat food that is, obviously we all eat food. When we have a more regulated nervous system, we have to be less strict about our diet because our system actually can handle varieties of food without reacting to it. Our mental ability to process and think is clear. We can focus. A lot of people will complain and say that they have brain fog. ADD is a sign of dysregulation. It's not a disease. It's a sign of the environment not being safe and the system can't focus. We have to understand that when our system is in survival stress 24/7, it is virtually impossible to use our higher brain effectively. Our impulse control goes off. We can't think clearly. We can't even see clearly. Things are a fog. And that's because our survival physiology is not meant to be on 24/7. It's meant to be on for a short period of time, like minutes, and then we have to come out of it. However, as humanity, we have been living as a cultural collective in this state of dysregulation for centuries. And that is where all of these social problems, environmental problems, physical problems, mental health problems, chronic illness problems come up. It's because we're in that soup of survival stress. So we know that we're healing when the global system starts to change. And so it could be that a person just notices, I feel a little more at ease talking to this stranger, or I'm going to sleep a lot easier, or when I eat, I'm not having problems with digestion, or I have a desire to be socially engaged with people. Humans, mammals, we are creatures of social engagement. We're warm-blooded. We want connection. We want to be with people. However, if we've had a history where the environment and our upbringing wasn't safe and the people in our environment weren't safe, that will not be our primary map of functioning. Our map of functioning is lock myself in the room and hide from the world and make everything very perfect and controlled. And so part of healing is starting to allow ourselves to not be as perfect, connecting with people, and also being more empathetic and understanding others in a deeper way. So that's one or some of the reasons how we know that we are getting more regulated. Okay, here's a question on, just let me have something to drink here. Someone asks, can I still heal and build regulation in my nervous system if I have developmental trauma and I'm too uncomfortable to touch work with my therapist? Absolutely. Absolutely. And this is actually, if you haven't checked out my online programs, I think your name is Viveka, please do, and look for an article on my blog site called Why Online Healing Really Works. You're right. If we have had developmental trauma, touch is going to be terrifying, right? And that's true. People say, oh, you need, touch is important. Getting lots of hugs is important. For someone that's had developmental trauma where touch was not healthy, and it doesn't have to be out of a physical or sexual abusive situation. It could be you were in a hospital when you were 5 months old and you were being poked and prodded as they tried to save your life, right? There are situations where touch is well-intentioned, but as an infant, for example, you don't know the difference. All you know is something doesn't feel right, you're in pain, and so then you connect that touch with something bad is happening to me. So what we found in the online work that I do, that we've been doing for over 5 years now, people in over 63 countries have gone through these programs. We teach you how to bring self-touch to your system, how to titrate the experience of being back in your body in small little bits so that it doesn't overwhelm you and you start to build the foundation and the capacity to be connected to yourself. So that's one of the primary things of healing developmental trauma is capacity, building capacity in your system, foundations, and being able to reconnect with yourself first rather than necessarily having someone connect with you, because that can just be super, super scary. Someone says, does that mean a lot of us who are introverted or have social anxiety are traumatized? In my experience, yes. I don't like to use the word traumatized for one reason. And the reason why, and you'll learn this if you take part in my 3-part healing trauma series. It's a video series, totally free on my site. Be sure to watch that because that'll give you the more deeper details. But to me, it's survival stress. It's having high levels of survival stress, that fight, flight, or the shutdown response of freeze. I'm going to talk about that in a second. The reason I don't like to say traumatized is some things that we might think of as traumatic won't cause a traumatic reaction in some people. And it depends on what I talked about at the very beginning of this talk. If someone had good regulation to begin with, they could have a traumatic event occur to them and they won't end up being traumatized. So for me, what I like to say is survival stress. For example, anxiety. To me, I teach my students, change the wording. It's not anxiety, it's survival stress. It's sympathetic arousal energy. It's the sympathetic nervous system, that fight, flight, looking for a desire to attack or flee. It's that racing heart rate of the survival stress. And if we can see these things as, oh, this is me wanting to shut down and freeze to protect. Oh, that's what I'm doing when I hide. That's what I'm doing when I feel this heart rate. This is my survival physiology speaking to me, and I need to listen to it. Okay. So where did my, oh yeah. So here's a question that I get a lot. It's around adrenal fatigue. So someone asks, adrenal fatigue is what I am experiencing. On top of trauma, lots of deaths in the family over a 6-week period, including my dad, and ended with my son. I'm so sorry about that. What do I need to do to start climbing out of this fatigue, sadness, depression while taking care of myself and children and while working? Wow, so that's a big one. So the first thing to understand, it's important that we grieve and it's important that we feel the loss and the sadness. And we also don't want to get so wrapped in it that it engulfs and consumes us. It's very important to have support, and how that looks is going to be very individual. It might be a partner, it might be a friend, it might be a sibling, it might be a church group, it might be an online group. A lot of my students find a lot of peace and solace in our groups because it's just all about the nervous system and healing. It could be connecting with pets. It could be connecting with people in the outside world who are just passerby, but we feel connection with other people. This is going to sound odd. You'll see in the background, I have lots of plants. I have a lot of plants in my home because they're living creatures, just like we are. So caring sometimes for something like that, believe it or not, can be very nurturing and healing. But we want to grieve. We want to feel. But then what we want to do is we want to start looking for small little bits of joy, of pleasure. And when we've been hit with so many awful things, that can sometimes feel absolutely impossible, but you got to try. Whether it's just being, I have oxygen to breathe. I have a working body that can properly process food. I know that, again, sounds really strange, but some just basic gratitude practices towards what you do still have can go a long way. And over time, they do mount up. In terms of adrenal fatigue is, again, the system being in locked down survival stress. So the adrenals live on top of our kidneys, kind of mid-lower back, and they are what pump out adrenaline and cortisol. And so when we've been under high levels of stress, these little glands, they pump out survival chemicals to keep us going, to keep us in our fight flee mode. However, over time, because adrenaline is not efficient for keeping us alert and pumped up in a way with survival stress, the system puts out cortisol because it's longer acting. It's a steroid hormone. Now, this is okay in small doses, but what occurs is if this is over weeks and weeks and months, and for some and many people, whole decades and lifetimes, that cortisol becomes toxic to the cells and the brain. And it is what creates a lot of havoc in our physical systems, and it throws our hormonal systems out of whack. Interestingly enough, when you work directly with the stress physiology and you learn how to be with those sensations and come back to the system and build capacity within the system, again, what we teach in the work that I do or what you would learn if you worked with a really good somatic experiencing practitioner or someone trained in the somatic healing arts. Building that capacity allows the stress response to start to be a little less on and engaged. And we want to almost imagine these stress chemicals just lowering down in the system, imagining them, in a sense, washing out to sea. One of the practices I do with my students in my longer program, Smart Body, Smart Mind, we call it working with the kidney adrenals. And this is something I learned through one of my mentors, Kathy Kane, who's a wonderful teacher. Her work is called Somatic Practice. Look her up. She does great work. I did a long form interview with her that you can find on this YouTube channel that I highly recommend. But Kathy's not primary work, one of the big pieces of her work is working with people's kidneys and adrenals through very solid intention. It's not about manipulating them, but just holding them in attention. It might involve gentle touch. I do it with my students where they visualize it. And you literally visualize how those kidneys and adrenals can lower and become softer and become less on guard. And we need to practice that in order to bring our stress physiology down. This is not something that we do just once and then it is over. This is something that we would want to practice daily, even hourly, over weeks and months and years. And I know that sounds like a long time, but in the grand scope of our life and how long we've maybe held these survival stresses in our system, it actually isn't. And what occurs is as we start to work and have intention of bringing this stress response down, and I keep using my hands because it's literally like rain falling. It's like we want to just soothe the system and calm it down and bring it down. Over time, that lays foundation for the system to not be so freaked out. And that sense, it's not the best technical term, but when our system just freaks out, we need to feel it and go, okay, it's time to calm down. It's not about shutting it down. Very different. It's not about disconnecting. It's about feeling that intensity and then working with it to slowly, slowly, slowly lower it. It's the same way, if I go back to what I talked about at the very beginning, it's the same way that we would teach a newborn baby how to soothe. I wish I had one right here. But you don't just take a baby when it's crying and say, okay, you're okay, and then put it down. You have to feel it. You have to touch it. You have to rock it. You have to pat it. You have to gently speak and feel and hold it and listen to it. And then slowly it starts to shimmer down, to calm down. As you do that more and more with a baby, if you've had children and you've learned how to connect with them in that secure way, they calm down a lot faster. They learn, oh, this is the connection. This is what it feels like to feel myself and to be regulated. So in essence, when we have a situation in our system where we have adrenal fatigue, and then there are other conditions that come with so this will bleed in beautifully with the next question I'm going to answer. When we have this occur, we want to treat ourselves like we are nurturing a newborn baby that's freaking out. And that's going to take some time. It's like we're trying to teach the system how to regulate over and over again. Okay, I'm going to go, is somatic therapy the most efficient therapy for complex PTSD? In my opinion, Amelia, yes. The reason why, and I've been talking about this, complex PTSD is not just in the brain. There is this misconception that trauma is in the brain. It shifts things in the brain. It creates a brain that might be more able to react to stressful and unfavorable environments and conditions. But essentially, the trauma is in the nervous system and in the physiology. It's in the organs, it's in the tissues, it's in how our muscles contract, right? If you think about this, the classic example is the war veteran that comes back from war. They were in explosions and gunfires, and then they come home and they're no longer in that war zone, but they hear a car backfire or they hear a big bang and they jump. That jump is so reflexive. It is in the physiology. It's being interpreted in the brain as something bad is out there, But it happens the same way, when you get something like goosebumps, where you feel something weird, or you hear something, or you get a chill, it comes over your entire physical body, right? When you get goosebumps or a chill, it's not just in your little finger, it's the entire organism. So complex PTSD is best addressed when you're addressing the entire organism. So top down and bottom up and all of the in-betweens. Sometimes, depending on an individual, they might need a good talk therapist so that they can just get out the stuff that they're holding in their brains. They got to get it out. But then what we need to do is we need to teach that person how to be with their physiology bit by bit by bit. We need to teach them how to lower their stress response. Because if they don't learn that deeper somatic level, that somatic system will run the show. So one of my teachers, again, Kathy Kane, I quote her a lot. She's taught me so much. She often will say, and this is from one of her mentors, that the brain is an end organ. It's an end organ. This is why so many of our students who come into my 2 online programs, whether it's Smart Body, Smart Mind, or the 21-day nervous system tune-up, or when I was in private practice, they will have tried everything. Talk therapy, energy work, workshops, retreats. They've gone to shamans, they've tried ayahuasca, they've done diets, they've done tapping, they've done everything. And what they're missing, for the most part, is working directly at building the capacity of the nervous system to be with sensations. So hopefully that gives a little bit around that. And I want to get into more the chronic health problems, because this is something that is often asked about. And one question, I'm going to connect these. So one question here is, have you heard of PMDD? So that's premenstrual dysphoric disorder. It's it's classified as a more severe PMS for women. So yes, I've heard of this. So hold that thought. And then the other question, where did it go? Could a hypervigilant nervous system, so that's a great way of describing this. So hypervigilant is that system that's in fight, flight. It's looking for danger. It's looking for stress. It's like, who's going to attack me? How do I need to defend, et cetera, et cetera. So how could a hypervigilant nervous system, syndromal type, develop an immune system that is overreacting like in autoimmune conditions? Okay, maybe this will be our final question. We'll see here, because this is going to take a tiny bit to unpack. Number one, so our physiology, our body system, the digestion, the hormones, the immune system, the muscular system, the cardiovascular system, the renal system, the lymphatic system, all the systems in the body. I'm sure I've missed something. It is governed by the autonomic nervous system, the same system that governs our survival physiology, the fight, flight, and freeze. So we have this autonomic nervous system, part of our peripheral nervous system, different than our brain and spinal cord. So the autonomic nervous system, it's what allows us. So if I take this drink of iced tea, naturally swallow, it's going to go, I can feel it going down my esophagus, it's going to go into my stomach. It's going to do all of that automatically, thank God, because it would take forever and it would be impossible to live if you had to think about all these things. If I was to eat some food, my system would notice a spike in glucose in the blood, and it would release insulin from the pancreas to bring that glucose back in and integrate it, etc. So hopefully you're getting my point here. So we have this autonomic nervous system that governs our hormones, our digestion, our need for our heart rate to go up if we start to exercise, or when we're just sitting, it might come down a little bit. It lowers the blood pressure. When we've had chronic stress, adversity, maybe we didn't learn from the beginning that self-soothing from good nurturing parents. Maybe we had a surgery when we were little. Maybe there's so many factors that can create a dysregulated nervous system. When that autonomic nervous system is on fight, flight, freeze, there is this cycling situation where one system is cycling and then the other is trying to stop it, or one is going really fast and the other is trying to stop it. So the best example is if you've got this fight flight energy, that's the sympathetic nervous system, is looking for danger. It knows it's not safe. It wants to spike the heart rate to flee, but then the system is like, no, 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 that's not safe. It's not safe to fight. It's not safe to talk. It's not safe to set boundaries. You might get hurt. We're just going to shut down, right? This goes back to the baby that's crying, crying, crying. Nobody's there. I'm just going to shut down. Or being exposed to severe situations. Over time, the system can't cope, so it shuts down. But under that shutdown is this fight flight that's just brewing like crazy. And what occurs is this cycling of that sympathetic nervous system along with this parasympathetic that's trying to shut it down. I'm not going to go into the deep aspects of the polyvagal theory, but this is where the polyvagal theory comes in. The vagus nerve, many of you have maybe heard of it. Part of the vagus nerve, not all of it, because it's got many branches, is shutting this down, saying it is not safe. But when you've got this cycling of fight, flight energy and this shutdown, the system starts to break down. And so this question about the immune system and the premenstrual dysphoric disorder, Peter Levine, one of the people I've learned with, he calls PMS and more severe menstrual troubles in the female reproductive system, he calls them reproductive migraines. And basically a migraine is the system having lots of vasoconstriction, but lots of opposite to vasoconstriction. And so there's this bind. It's like something's trying to go through a tube, literally, and there's something else constricting it. And when that occurs, that is where the pain can start. That's where the spasms start. If we think about the gut, a healthy gut will have these valves and tubes that just go nice and gentle. I'm using my hands to describe this. And things come in, it processes, it releases juices, it does its thing, it releases, the bowels move, everything's beautiful. But when the autonomic nervous system is in this fight, flight, freeze bind, it then sends the signal to these processes that it governs, being like, okay, we're gonna go fast, and then we're gonna stop it, and when we're gonna go, and then we're gonna stop it. This is what causes chronic diarrhea, chronic constipation, or both, which is the case in a lot of people with complex PTSD and autoimmune conditions. So in terms of the menstrual problems, in terms of the autoimmune system, yes, the immune system will be governed by this autonomic nervous system that's can't make up its mind. Part of it wants to fight and part of it wants to shut down. And that is where the troubles arise. And so autoimmune system, that could be anywhere from MS, ALS, bowel problems, Crohn's, migraine headaches, menstrual reproductive troubles, cardiovascular troubles, trouble maintaining blood pressure, right? We want to have our blood pressure go up when we're doing activity, and we want it to go down when we're not being active. When someone has got stored survival stress, sometimes that flips. And that is where the system feels a heart rate and an intensity, and it matches a past traumatic experience, and the system's like, that's not safe, we're shutting you down. That's one reason why some people pass out, or why they feel lightheaded, or they can't get the energy to their body to move and exercise. It's because there's this cycling of the sympathetic and the parasympathetic at the same time, and they're working at cross purposes, and that's where things go off. So that was a very quick description. I've done other videos on this on my YouTube channel. One of them is called How Trauma Creates Chronic Illness. We can post it up there, but you can also find it on my site. It's one of the more popular watched videos. But I actually draw this out on a graph on that video, and I explain it in greater detail. So yes, we've really started to see that these chronic issues are a result of trapped survival stress. So what I'm going to say with this is I'm going to bring in a piece of research because I think it's really important. If you're new to this, you might be like, this seems almost too good to be true, Irene, that just having trapped survival stress, what we would call being traumatized on a low level, would create all of these mental and chronic health troubles, social anxieties, etc. And the answer is the research is really pointing in that direction. The Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, it's also dubbed the ACE study. This was done quite a while ago in the early, well, not quite a while ago, but in the 90s, late 80s. And I've done quite a few, I've done some podcast episodes on this. There's some articles I've written about this. Just look up ACE, chronic illness, my name, you'll find stuff. Basically, they found that people who suffer from a whole host of physical conditions and mental, there's a long list, all the way from heart disease to certain cancers, to IBS, to Crohn's, to migraines, to reproductive problems, mental health issues, depression, anxiety, there's so much, is very linked, statistically so, to the point where it's almost conclusive. It is linked to early childhood stress. And this comes back to what I talked about at the top of the hour at 12 o'clock, was when our system doesn't have that good regulation, right? When we don't have that connection and nurturing and secure attachment that teaches our sympathetic and parasympathetic how to be in symbiosis, how to be in harmony. When we don't learn that from the beginning, and our MO, our way of living, is that chronic, one is on and one is trying to shut it down, being in cross purposes, that over a lifetime will express our predisposition to disease. And all of us have it. You know, I've got history of stroke in my family. I have history of skin troubles in my family. And when my system was more dysregulated, I didn't have a stroke, knock on wood, but I had skin troubles. Things were coming out in certain ways. Other people will have tummy problems. Other people will get cancers. Other people will have trouble with their cholesterol, autoimmune, mental health, etc. So this study has really shown, via the other research we're seeing about how mammals, humans, need connection. We need self-regulation. When we don't get it, it predisposes us to more health problems, mental and physical. The other amazing resource is Gabor Mate. He talks about this stuff. His book, When the Body Says No, really gets into chronic conditions and pretty much backs up what the research has showed and what the science shows. So these are really important topics, because a lot of our self-care practices and medical practices are working to try to fix the problem from the outside. They're not going to the root. And sometimes we need to have something to soothe the system. Sometimes we need an interim Band-Aid. Sometimes we need to learn a breath exercise to calm us down in the moment. And my goal, my desire, my interest is, how can we bring us all back to good regulation so that we don't need all of these practices, that we don't need all these strategies and coping management systems to stay in check. Essentially, how can we heal our systems from the ground up, build foundation, build capacity, so that we can just go about our day and not have to have all of these rules and regulations around how we live our lives and how we express. So what I'd love to do, I'm just going to look here and see. Thank you for all your comments. I want to end with one question, actually, that I think is great. They're all great questions, but it's something that often gets confused. So I'll end with that in a second. But if you are new to me, if you have not visited my site, be sure to go to that. I'm not just a person on YouTube. I have a website with, you can read about my history, my background, where I've come from. I'm trained by the best and the best in the somatic trauma healing world. I am a researcher. I have a master's in science. I have exercise science under my background, health, applied nutrition, all that jazz. And the two programs I've created, both Smart Body, Smart Mind, and the 21-Day Nervous System Tune-Up, run throughout the year. 21 days, you can start right now. That will teach you more education and more practices. So how to actually work with your nervous system, how to work at this level of the neuroplastic level to sequence your healing properly. Again, a lot of times people start too high up on the spectrum of advanced practice. So again, advanced practice would be things like breath work and meditation, and even a lot of the cognitive behavioral therapies are missing the body, missing the sensations. And we need to get into that system and work with that system so that it can start to build capacity and feel safer, essentially. We want to build more safety into the system, and we can't just do that by thinking about being safe. We have to learn how to re-feel it in a different way. So be sure to check out those resources. I plan to keep bringing up videos here every week. We've got tons of videos here that you can watch, and like I said, a blog that has lots of articles. But this question came in from someone, and she said, this is an interesting one. It has to do with artists. And I consider myself, in a strange way, an artist, a creative. I have many friends who are. And the question is, many artists find their pain to be a place from which to create. And this is true, right? We know of many in the history of the world, people who were amazing artists and architects and singers and comedians who are being driven by their pain, their dysregulation, and it creates some pretty impressive stuff. However, as we know, many of those people don't survive. So they ask, is there a risk that healing or resolving trauma will actually inhibit or end altogether their creative ability or inspiration? Great question. The answer is no. And the reason I know that is I've worked with artists. People have gone through this work of learning how to restore regulation, release traumas. And what occurs is the art still occurs, but it's at a different level. It's still beautiful, it's still creative, but it's not being driven out of survival. It's being driven out of pure, true human creativity and curiosity, as opposed to as a way to mask or numb or express pain. And I think that it's really interesting to see. I've seen the artwork at some of my students, and as they become more regulated, I'm thinking of one of my students, Mathilde Barry. She's from Germany. She's a painter. Look her up. Her artwork is just getting more and more stunning and beautiful. I'm getting shivers thinking about it as she becomes more regulated, more in tune with herself, and is being driven from a sense of curiosity and play, as opposed to, I have to get this art or else I'm gonna explode kind of thing. And so we have to remember, all of us here, you, me, us humans, our higher brain, this cortex that's up here, everybody say hello to their cortex, it is still so new on the scene of human evolution. And for the most part, it has been used for survival, for creating the world that we live in now. And of course, there's a lot of creativity that's been created non-survival based, but for the most part, a lot of it has been survival based. People often say we haven't even tapped into our potential in our brain. We only use a certain percentage. I believe that's true, but I also believe we're going to really find that evolution and that absolute creative spark and the ability to solve our biggest problems and create the things that are going to work for us the best here on Earth, as with us humans here, when we can get out of survival stress, when we can heal these old traumatic stresses that are harboring inside of us, and we can get into this higher brain and use it for what it's really meant to be used for, which is to create and to connect and to be with humans and whatever else might be out there in the universe. So love that question, because no, I believe that when we get more healed in our nervous system and release our traumas, we're going to see a type of creativity that we haven't even begun to witness yet. So again, her name is Mathilde. We'll pop it up there. Barry, Berry. She's an artist from Hamburg, Germany. Just look that up and you'll find her. Thank you guys for being here. I know that there are a lot of other questions that probably came up here. What I want to suggest take a look at the programs that I offer. They, as I said, we've had people from 63 countries go through them. This is the real deal. I've done my homework. I've done my training. Be sure to look at my site, see where I've come from, my credentials. This is true healing at the nervous system level, and it must occur in a certain order. I've been doing this work long enough to know that that is the truth. That is just the way it is. So if you are feeling pulled to experiment, to learn the language of your nervous system and really get into those roots of what it takes to heal for real, please join me and my team for one of these offerings, one of these programs. We'd love to see you in there. So thank you so much. Thanks to Crystal, who's been helping me post things here. We're new at this YouTube live thing, so if you've liked this little Q&A session, I didn't get to all the questions. I'd rather be thorough with a few questions than pop out, lots of them and not get into them deeper. So I hope this has been a good experience for you. I hope you've learned something. If you've learned something interesting, teach someone else in your world. See how you can apply some of this to what you do in your day-to-day. And be well. Happy July if you're listening to this in July 2019. We'll see you next time. Bye, everybody.